chess friends, how are you? Today, we'll discuss a really strong and risky strategy in chess when your opponent plays the Sicilian defense with c5, it's called the Grand Prix variation. Here's how it works. On your second move, you move your knight to c3, then, no matter what move black makes next, like d6 or something else, you follow up with the move pawn to f4. This move kicks off what's known as the Grand Prix attack. When you play f4, you'll notice that it creates extra space on the side where your king is. This extra space is super helpful later in the game when you want to launch a strong attack in the middle. If your opponent moves their knight to c6 or does almost any other developing move, it doesn't affect your plan. That's the beauty of this opening. You can use the same moves repeatedly without having to memorize different variations. If your opponent plays something like g6 to develop their bishop, they're leaving their bishop undefended. In this situation, it's a good idea to develop your bishop to b5, attacking their knight and putting pressure on their king's side. Developing this bishop is important because eventually, you'll want to bring it into the game. To do that, you'll have to move the pawn in front of it. If you move the pawn in front of the bishop first, it blocks the bishop's path, so, to avoid that problem, you bring out the light-squared bishop first, then, you can safely move the pawn to d3 later, giving space for the other bishop. That's why we play bishop b5. Firstly, by playing bishop b5, we develop our bishop. Secondly, we pin the knight. Lastly, in the future, we can trade on c6, causing our opponent to have doubled pawns, which can be advantageous for us. If they play bishop d7 to prevent the pin, it doesn't really change anything for us. We just continue developing our pieces and prepare to castle. In many cases, your opponents will make a mistake. They might play a6 to try to move your bishop or make it trade with their knight. However, your bishop on b5 is waiting to capture on c6 eventually, so it doesn't mind being attacked. So, playing a6 for black is not very effective because you were going to take on c6 at some point regardless. It's a bit of a waste of their time. So, after they recapture, you play d3. This move is to keep the center closed because you want to concentrate on attacking their kingside. Especially since you expect them to castle there later. Exactly. Playing d3 also ensures that the center remains closed, which means your opponent's bishops won't have open diagonals to move along and won't have many good options for movement or attacking. When your opponent plays bishop g7, it's time to start implementing your straightforward yet powerful middle game strategy. You begin by moving your queen to the kingside with queen e1 followed by queen h4. After playing qe1 and your opponent develops their pieces, you follow up with queen h4. This move makes your queen very active because you anticipate your opponent castling kingside. Your queen is already positioned to threaten checkmate once their king is there. This sequence reveals the main purpose of the Grand Prix attack, which is to quickly launch a kingside attack and checkmate the opponent's king. By pushing the f4 pawn to f5, you create a powerful threat. Once you reach this position, your chances of winning are very high. The moves that follow are difficult for black to defend against, and they will struggle to find a way to create counterplay. No matter what black does, you'll continue with the same attacking moves. When you reach this position, you might start feeling sorry for your opponents because they'll be spending a lot of time thinking and calculating variations, trying to figure out their best move. When I reached this point in the game, I could sense my opponents struggling, trying to figure out their best move. Inside, I knew the game was practically over for them. The move f5 not only gives me more space on the kingside but also opens up a diagonal for my bishop. The next move I play is bh6. With the pawn on f5, you're prepared to trade pieces, and your rook from f1 can also get into the attack. Whether black captures here or makes another move, it doesn't change much. You can recapture or simply continue with bishop h6. Black's king has only two defenders at this point, the bishop on g7 and the knight on f6. You aim to remove both defenders of the black king, leaving it vulnerable. So, you start by playing bishop h6, ready to trade pieces. If your opponent captures here, it's beneficial for you because your queen will be closer to their king. If they don't take and make another move, like capturing the pawn, they might be getting greedy. You have a strong attack going, so you might not even need to recapture immediately. Following your plan, you can play knight g5. This move brings the knight into the game and adds pressure on the pawn. It also opens up a file for your rook. giving you the option to remove the second defender of the black king whenever you want. And let me share a quote with you. There are no shortcuts to living your greatest life, and becoming your best self. Now, if black continues to play greedily, you're in a good position to take advantage of their mistakes. If black keeps capturing pieces, it's a sign that they are in a difficult position with weak defense. To win, you start by removing all the defenders of the king one by one. You would like to play queen takes h7 to checkmate, but the pawn is protected by the knight. However, it's simple to eliminate the last defender by playing rook takes f6, exactly. Once you play rook takes f6, it leaves the black king exposed with very little defense. If black captures with the pawn, it doesn't change the outcome because queen takes h7 is checkmate. Even if black captures with the king, the exposed king will not last long against your attacking pieces, especially with potential discovered checks in the mix. There are multiple ways to continue the attack. You can move your knight to create a discovered check, or bring your rook into the attack for another check, adding more pressure. Regardless of how black responds, whether the king goes back or moves bravely to the middle with king e5, the same checkmate pattern, such as achieving checkmate with queen f4. Let's go back to the important moment, when you've just started your attack, and your opponent doesn't realize how risky their position is. Instead of capturing the pawn on f5, they make another move, like b5. Since b5 is a common move in the Sicilian defense, your opponent might want to expand on that side and push your knight back. If they play before after you play bishop h6, you could simply retreat the knight and continue with your usual plan, which would work fine. However, your attack is powerful enough that you could even ignore your opponent's move and play knight g5 anyway. He takes it on c3. Now, how do you continue your attack? You want to remove this defender and then target the defender on f6, but there's a pawn blocking the way. What do? You trade it off. He will capture back either with this pawn or that pawn. Exactly, it doesn't matter which piece your opponent captures with. You continue eliminating their defenders one by one. You trade off the bishop, and then you take here. Although the pawn is defended, you remove this defender. Whether your opponent captures back with the rook, king, or pawn, it all leads to the same result. If he captures with the rook, queen takes h7 leads to checkmate with queen h8. If he takes with the pawn after rook takes f6, it's still queen takes h7 leading to checkmate. If he captures with the king, you can play rook f1 for the same checkmate possibilities we discussed earlier. He can either face the queen h7 checkmate or move to the center, where he'll get checked repeatedly until it's checkmate. It almost seems unfair to the opponent. Going back to the key moment, when you make your move, the opponent is really focused, trying to figure out if their move can change the outcome. At this stage, it's too late for him. He's in a tough spot. And let me tell you a quote in Sudden. The more anger you hold in your past, the less capable you are of loving the present. We've covered the primary strategy of the Grand Prix attack, and there's also a backup plan. If the first plan fails, we have plan B. We start with knight c3 and then move to rook f4, when you use the Vienna gambit as white against e5, with moves like e4, knight c3, and knight f4, you're setting up for kingside expansion, which opens up many attacking chances. However, be aware that opponents might counter with moves like e6 and knight d5. It's quite typical for opponents to play e6, followed by d5 after you move knight f3. If they continue developing with knight f6, bishop e7, and then castle, your usual kingside attack strategy might not be as effective because they're pressuring your center. But that's when you switch to another plan, which interestingly involves the same moves you've been playing. We start with bishop e5 to develop the bishop, and pinning the knight is a bonus for us. Often, they'll play a6, aiming to get rid of your active bishop, but that's okay because you were planning to trade it anyway. Then you move d3 to lock the position, especially since your opponent has two bishops, and you want to keep the game closed. Exactly, by keeping the position locked, the opponent's light squared bishop becomes quite restricted in movement. This is a strategic advantage, as it limits how effective that bishop can be in the game. If black develops with knight f6 and castles, a frequent mistake they make is pushing their pawn to d4. This move solidifies their pawn structure but also makes it very static and inflexible. They lose the opportunity to exchange on e4, even though the pawn is defended. This means they don't gain any tactical advantage from such an exchange. Indeed, playing pawn to d4 just further solidifies the position, which becomes very disadvantageous for black. Moving our knight to a4 is a strategic choice. While other squares could work for the knight, a4 is particularly effective because it puts pressure on black's pawn at c5, enhancing our positional advantage. Now, our typical kingside attack won't work as well. For instance, if you move your queen to h4, black's bishop from e7 can exchange it, which isn't great for us. Also, playing f5 isn't as strong because black's bishop is still on that diagonal and could potentially capture the pawn. So, the conventional attack plan involving queen e1 to queen h4 isn't as effective in this situation. Instead, you can focus on another plan, which involves exploiting these weaknesses. This approach is very effective. A key move to remember is playing pawn to b3. This move is strategic as it prevents black from even considering advancing their pawn in certain variations. By doing this, you're solidifying control and stopping black's potential counterplay. If your pawn isn't on b3, your opponent might try to play c4 at some point to eliminate their doubled pawn. If you take it, their pawn on e4 becomes undefended, allowing them to recapture. This way, they can employ a tactical maneuver to remove their weakness. Playing b3 solidifies the position, permanently fixing the opponent's weakness. They won't be able to eliminate this disadvantage for the rest of the game. After they castle, you can directly target these doubled pawns. Moves like bishop a3 can attack one of the pawns, and knight e5 can target the other. You can coordinate these attacks to intensify the pressure on the doubled pawns. Moving knight e5 targets the pawn, and your opponent might defend it with their queen or bishop, but when you play bishop a3, you're attacking the pawn twice. This leaves your opponent in a tough spot. Unable to adequately defend the pawn, their position begins to deteriorate, as they struggle to hold their pawn structure together. With all these weak pawns and a passive bishop that's trapped, black is essentially out of good options, making it a nearly one game for white. Additionally, you can move your queen to g3 to further intimidate your opponent, adding pressure and challenging them to find any viable defense. If you prefer not to move your queen to h4, placing it on g3 is a good alternative. This move still supports your main objective of targeting your opponent's weaknesses. With this strategy, you have plenty of options to advance your position, while your opponent remains passive and unable to counter effectively. This becomes your plan B, a solid fallback when plan A isn't viable. By now, you've learned how to execute the Grand Prix attack effectively. The advantage here is that you don't need to memorize numerous variations like in the Open Sicilian, where black can choose from about 10 major systems, making it quite complex. In contrast, with the Grand Prix attack, you can stick to straightforward plans, simplifying your strategy and decision-making process in the game. However, if you encounter a more advanced and prepared opponent, they might opt for a different approach. After playing knight c6 and f4, they could go for g6 immediately. Their strategy involves not moving any of their central pawns early on, indicating a more subtle and possibly more strategic game plan. When you move bishop e5 in this situation, it won't create a pin since black's pawn is still on d7, not moved to d6 or d5, so there's no pin on the knight. You can play bishop e5, but it allows black's knight to move to d4, appearing active. However, this isn't particularly dangerous, as your bishop on b5 is defended by your knight on c3. Generally, trading off this bishop is acceptable in your strategy. You can proceed with your game plan, opting to castle and continue with your established strategy. Trading off the bishops are acceptable, it aligns with your overall plan. After that, you can carry on with the maneuvers we discussed earlier. However, it's important to note that the knight on d4 can still pose some tactical challenges, so it's something to keep an eye on. The knight on d4 can get in the way of your plans, so let's consider a different approach for more advanced play. If your opponent hasn't moved their central pawns forward, preventing you from pinning their knight, you can play a3. This move offers a more nuanced way to handle the situation. Playing a3 might seem odd initially, but it's actually quite clever. Typically, your opponent will respond with e6 and knight d7. They do this to develop their pieces and prepare for castling. They avoid moving the knight to f6 immediately because if they do, you can play e5 and force the knight to move again. Your knight controls the central squares, so if black plays knight f6, you can push it back to the edge of the board, which they want to avoid. If black tries to play d6 first, you can take advantage of the opened diagonal and bring your bishop back to b5, its original and preferred square. This allows you to revert to your usual plan, utilizing the bishop's positioning effectively. That's good to keep in mind. Assuming you're playing against a more advanced opponent, they will likely be aware of your plan and will try to counter it effectively, so they opt for e6, intending to play knight e7. This move is strategically sound for them. If you move bishop e5 and they play knight e7, the knight supports its counterpart. Thus, if you capture, they don't have to compromise their pawn structure. Moreover, this placement of the knight overprotects the f5 square, potentially making it more difficult for you to advance with f5 in the middle game. That's why I mentioned that we're now facing a good opponent who understands our strategy and is working hard to stop it. But here's the thing, instead of playing bishop b5, since there's no pin, we now show the purpose of this move by playing pawn to a3, then, suddenly we play d4 and attack on the queenside, which surprises black. Our goal is to exploit the weaknesses created in their position due to their pawn structure and moves. We aim to take advantage of the weaknesses around those pawns. When we play b4, it attacks the pawn on c5, potentially setting up a threat to advance with b5, usually. Your opponent will capture here, realizing that their pawn is vulnerable and should be taken. If they don't, you can push b5 yourself to further pressure their position. After black captures the pawn, you can play bishop a3, putting black in serious trouble. This move attacks the knight, forcing it to retreat. Now, observe the powerful bishop that dominates weak squares and prevents black from castling. Additionally, you can bring your knight to b5, threatening knight to d6 check, which puts black in a difficult position with limited options. Both ideas, whether it's bishop to d6 or knight to d6, are incredibly powerful. For example, if they choose any normal kind of move, you can play bishop d6, completely paralyzing black's position. Now, knight c7 will be a checkmate. Therefore, they have to sacrifice their queen. Therefore, the d6 square will create a complete paralyzation situation for white. Even though you open up a diagonal for their bishop, you shouldn't be concerned because your threats are much stronger. Additionally, if they give up their bishop, your queen can also target their rook from that square, adding to the pressure and supporting your attack. If you don't need to recapture immediately, you can play knight to d6, checking the king. If the king moves to any square, either here or here, it exposes itself to a discovered check. You can capitalize on this by playing knight to b7, checking the king, and then capturing the queen on the following move. This sequence allows you to capture most, if not all, of their pieces. If black defends, let's say, you capture here, and then on the following move, you take the bishop on a1, now, you're also targeting the rook on h8, leading to a devastating position for black. It's as bad as it could get for them, and you're completely dominating the game. Sure, here's a simplified version, it's white's turn to move, and they can win the game. This is your today's chess puzzle, solve it and comment your answer. Let's see who can tell me the right answer. So wish you all the best, thanks for watching, subscribe for more, bye bye, take care, see you soon.